And clearly, the issue of fuel subsidy removal has continued to be on the front burner of national discourse, as many have expressed concerns or various opinions about the impact of deregulation of the downstream sector of the nation's economy and the citizens. However, President Buhari insisted that federal fuel subsidy will be completely removed in 2023, and it's no longer sustainable for the government to fund and release money for the provision meant for critical infrastructure across the country for subsidy. In the same vein, the World Bank has repeatedly warned that Nigeria's huge subsidy bill poses an existential crisis to the country and its more than 200 million citizens. I introduced him earlier. He's joining from our Abuja studios. He is the president of the Association of Capital Market Academics of Nigeria. He's also a professor of finance and capital market. He's no other person than Professor Uche Uwaleke. Prof, thank you very much. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much, Tolu. Happy holidays, and to all our Muslim brothers and sisters, happy Eid al-Maulud.
Thank you so much, Prof. Prof, let's start with that submission by the Minister of Finance saying about $2.3 billion is needed for the next 21 years to build infrastructure for us in Nigeria. Not forgetting what's happening already around Infraco that government intends to, put in some money. A seed fund of 1 trillion naira has been put into that. Take us through this and what you make of the state of our infrastructure with all of these efforts.
Well, once again, thanks. Tolu, if you don't mind, before I address that, there's something you put out there on the screen. I watched your first segment. You put out the numbers with respect to the 2023 budget proposal, and some of those numbers are not correct. So it's important that you effect the corrections for the benefit of your viewers. For example, the oil price benchmark in the 2023 budget is not $73 per barrel. As I saw on the screen, the oil price benchmark in the appropriation bill is $70 per barrel, not $73 per barrel. $70 per barrel is what we used, last year. The same goes for exchange rate. The exchange rate's benchmark in the 2023 budget is not 437 as you showed on your screen. It is you showed 437.57. No, the correct thing is 435, not 437. And the figure you also showed for capital expenditure. The capital spend in the 2023 budget is in excess of 5 trillion, 5.3 trillion, not 3 trillion, as again showed. So
our capital expenditure here is 5.35 trillion, Prof. Prof.
Yes, exactly.
Capital,
that's what
yes, 5.35 trillion is what I have here.
Earlier.
Yeah, so I'm sure maybe where there was a comparative analysis between correct. 22 and 23, maybe that was where that mix-up came up from. But go ahead.
Okay, beautiful. So now to your question, yes. Tolu. Let me say that the statement you quoted coming from the Minister of Finance to the fact that the country needs would need 2.3 trillion. That's $2.3 trillion to bridge the infrastructure gap, over the next 20 years. It was made at a conference that was organized by the Nigerian Institute of Architects, here in Abuja a few days ago. Incidentally, I was at that conference. I actually presented a paper alongside the finance minister. And that conference was really addressing the subject of integrated infrastructure, because my paper was on the socioeconomic perspectives of integrated infrastructure for national planning. And it was actually addressing the revised, I'm sure you're aware that there is a revised National Integrated Infrastructure Master Plan. Okay, that master plan is for a period of 23 years, 2020 to 2043. That's 23-year period. And the master plan is projecting that for us to fill the infrastructure gap, by the way, the stock of infrastructure to GDP in Nigeria is one of the lowest in sub-Saharan Africa. It has although gradually progressed from 26% a few years ago to about 35% now, but that's still low. Compare our stock of infrastructure to GDP, with what you have in South Africa, where you have it as high as 85%. So whether in terms of roads, rail, power, transport infrastructure generally, social infrastructure, and the likes, Nigeria is lagging behind other countries. And to fill or to bridge the infrastructure gap, the revised master plan, recall that the first master plan we had was in 2012, which is now being revised. That projects that the country will need $2.3 trillion. That's a huge sum between now and the next 23 years to be able to bridge that gap. And what that translates to is an annual spend of $150 billion every year. So we need to spend $150 billion every year for the next 23 years to be able to bridge the infrastructure gap. Where is that kind of money going to come from? Before now, we've relied majorly on budgetary appropriation and, of course, augmented by borrowing here and there from both domestic and foreign sources. But, of course, that hasn't been enough. And that's why the issue of engaging in private sector, PPP, is very much needed. As we speak, at present, what the country spends on infrastructure is on the average $3 billion a year. And I've told you that we need, by that plan, by that document, we need to spend up to $150 billion. So you can see the gap. 150 minus 3 is a very huge gap. Okay? Now, what the government has done, is to also see how the private sector can come in through some innovative schemes. I'm sure you're aware of the infrastructure tax credit that is already in operation. And in recent times, too, the Central Bank of Nigeria unveiled the Infraco, where it expects to put in over a period of time up to 15 trillion naira in infrastructure. Of course, the Infraco company is being championed by the central bank, but there are other stakeholders involved, including they also intend to get in the, apart from the African Finance Corporation, the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, the other private sectors. And remember too that the Sovereign Wealth Fund has an infrastructure component. Okay, aside from the other funds we know, aside from the Stabilization Fund and the Future Generation Fund, there is the infrastructure component of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which I understand is also part of what is being used to fund some projects already, such as the Second Niger Bridge, for example. So you have some of these private sector funds, coming in to support the this idea of bridging the infrastructure gap, because come to think of it, the amount involved is quite huge, and it's not something the government alone can do. And that is why if you find under the revised infrastructure master plan, the integrated one I was talking about, the government expects that the private sector should be able to bring in at least 56% of that requirement, while the government complements with 44%. But again, if you go to the National Development Plan 2021 to 2025, that is targeting as much as 348 trillion naira to be able to finance the development plan. Again, in that plan, the private sector has been projected to bring in at least 85 to 86% of the funds, while the government sector, both the federal and the state governments, will bring in just 14%. So that tells you where the emphasis is now. To bridge infrastructure in this country is not what the government alone can do. The private sector needs to play, a lot of roles. So PPP, public-private partnership, is being promoted, and as I mentioned earlier, some innovative schemes in infrastructure financing are also, being considered.
Indeed, great stuff there. Prof, another very important issue that I want us to touch on is the sustainability of subsidy payment. And the president has come out to say this is not sustainable. Considering what we have on ground, saying 2023, that the government might stop paying subsidy. Now, are you worried about government stopping to pay subsidy, or what we really subsidize? Which comes to you first?
Yeah, Tolu, the issue of subsidy.
Go ahead.
Yes, is quite unsustainable. If you look at the 2023 budget, it's even based on the assumption, okay, the aggregate spend of 20.5 trillion is based on that assumption that subsidy will go by June. So as from July, the intention is to run without subsidy. Now, if you look at what has happened this year, for example, 2022, if you look at the implementation report, between January and July, for example, we have been told that government has spent as much as 1.49 trillion on subsidy alone. Okay, so you can imagine what 1.49 trillion could have done in other sectors, in say education or health, for example. So it's one thing that continues to crowd out resources that could have been used in other areas. So the opportunity cost of having subsidy is so huge, and for me that also presents the major threat to the implementation of the 2023 budget. Because, as I said earlier on, the assumption is that it will go by June. But the question now is, will the incoming administration now be able to summon up the political will to remove subsidy by July? That is very unlikely, because any new government may not want to be welcomed by a crisis. And the more the subsidy stays, the more this budget proposal, or the more the 2023 budget, becomes unimplementable, if you permit that word. So it is something that continues to pose a threat to fiscal viability. The budget, 2023 budget, is titled Budget of Fiscal Consolidation and Transition. Again, I want to believe fiscal consolidation has not been used in the technical sense. Because if you talk about fiscal consolidation, even according to the OECD definition, it simply means a conscious policy of reducing government deficit and reducing accumulation of debt. But the 2023 budget is the opposite. Deficit is growing. What we have in the 2023 budget proposal is 4.8%. Budget deficit to GDP is 4.8%, which is higher than what we had, the previous year. Debt service, 6.3 trillion naira, is by far higher than what we had, again, the previous year. The new borrowing in 2023 budget, new borrowing is 8.8 trillion naira. Again, by far higher than what we had last year, when capital spend is just 5.3 trillion. So we are borrowing in excess of capital spend, meaning we are borrowing to also fund recurrent expenditure. And all this is made possible or reinforced, by the fact that we are still subsidizing consumption. We are still subsidizing fuel. I'm not opposed to subsidy. If we must subsidize, then let us subsidize production. Let us subsidize agriculture, for example, fertilizer, for example. These are things that should enjoy subsidy, not petroleum products. So the burden it is creating on public debt is huge. Part of why public debt is rising today is because we keep subsidizing fuel. And Tolu, come to think of it, is it not unfortunate that many years after the discovery of oil, in this country, we are still importing refined products. We have 4 refineries with the capacity to produce 5,000 barrels of oil, and none of them is functioning, and we are importing petroleum products. That is why you find this problem. Today we are consuming 17 billion liters of oil. The number, nobody's even sure of the number. It's a situation in which you import 99% of the one you use here is imported. Of course, creates a lot of problems. So the first thing to note is that it's placing a burden on our fiscal balance. Public debt is growing, partly on account of subsidy. The other thing to also note is that subsidy, critically speaking, is even regressive. Subsidy is regressive in the sense that when you analyze it critically, it is even the poor that are suffering. It's the rich that enjoy subsidy. There's a World Bank study I saw some time ago that talks about the richest 20%, richest 20% of low and middle income households use petroleum products 6 times more than the poorest 20%. Okay, so you now find that consumption of this fuel that is being subsidized is done more by the rich, and to that extent, it is regressive. So it's not something that is sustainable. I've made that point, and it's also encouraging smuggling. Part of why some of these products are smuggled outside is because of the huge differential between what we have here and what we have outside. And you also consider the fact that it is not encouraging investments into the sector. Many years after we found oil, the downstream sector of the petroleum industry has not been positioned to be able to contribute to the development of this country, partly because of this subsidy. So when you remove subsidy, you create a climate, a favorable climate for investors to come in because they know that prices will be competitive, the prices are not controlled, so they can now come in and also invest in a refinery.
Well, Prof, if you can hear me, there are some audio issues. We're hearing you again from Abuja studios. Well, thank you so much already. That's much time can take on this second half of discussion. I've been speaking to Professor Uche Uwaleke, who is the president of the Association of Capital Markets Academics of Nigeria, and of course is a professor of finance and capital market, making real sense of all of these figures. Thank you so much, Prof. I know we'll have a part 2 for this discussion. We can never have enough time to talk about Nigerian budget in just 15, 20 minutes. Thank you, and do enjoy the rest of your day.